Tim Pappa is an incident response engineer at Walmart Global Tech, driving efforts on Walmart Global Tech's cyber deception team at developing and applying cyber deception strategy, content creation, and marketing. More recently, Tim was an agent and a certified FBI profiler at the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, for nearly a half-dozen years, where he pioneered behavioral content creation in support of state and local cold case investigations throughout the United States. Tim is also one of the few certified former profilers in the world specializing in cyber deception and online influence. Tim has had multiple roles in the FBI and the intelligence community, including at Defense Intelligence Agency and Central Intelligence Agency. Tim recently published in the Journal of Information Warfare on applying Whaley's model of misperception and unexpected players to Muslim proselytizers in Indonesian Islamic boarding schools. Now, here is Tim.
Thank you for your time this morning. What I wanted to talk about was something as a practitioner I started doing when I was at Behavioral Analysis Unit, and since I've left BAU, it's something I'm still doing. But I wanted to start thinking about this in terms of what kind of conceptual models am I working with here? What makes this maybe a little bit different than way some other people might be applying their creation of content to influence behavior. So this is going to look at these two conceptual models, a consumer approach and a concentrated approach. That's what I'm calling it, at least, but it'll make sense as we go through it. I think it's really important, of course, not just to explore our theoretical foundations and our influences in that regard, but also what's shaped us through our lives, right? And for me, this has been a pathway that, of course, I didn't really realize until the years have gone on, that I've started to, in terms of being experiential, experiencing the way people respond to emotional content in other situations. But this is my pathway of what kind of shaped me. When I got to college, I studied journalism. I did a lot of investigative journalism work. And this is where I started to see the way people react to emotional stories. I mean, you'll see the literature out there now in terms of what makes people share content. I'm not necessarily talking about any kind of message adoption, but what makes them share content. And even if a lot of these studies are saying sad content, people don't move that as much as they do things that are funny, or things that are significant and interesting, or things that cause outrage. But when you're talking about an audience you already have within a specific community, say from a newspaper, it includes people from that community. Well, now you have an attentive audience, a channeled audience, and these things are going to matter to them. Of course, you'll see this deep into the literature on what causes people to actually spend time looking at things and processing and sharing it. But this is where I started to see this, and I'll go back to those 2 points in a minute. This is probably too small to see it, but I look back and thankfully, my college newspaper, The Post at Ohio University, they've archived all the editions, and on the far right here, you'll see it's an investigative series I did on this minor league hockey team that was taking people's money, defrauding people. This was a 3-part story series, and I never met any of these people in person. This is all via phone. But again, it was another anecdotal example of people are very motivated, and they're emotional, and they're experiencing a lot of affect, and they want to talk about things, and they react to things. And it's man, I didn't think about it at the time in terms of a conceptual model or what the theory might be tied to that. Of course not. I'm just a college student trying to, grow my journalism abilities. But when I look back on it, I'm this is exactly what was happening. You find a topic where there's some kind of affect there, and people are angry or upset about things, or there's outrage about it, and people want to talk about it. And that seems to get over a lot of challenges people would ordinarily have to talk about things, right? In terms of people don't want to be quoted and things like that. In this case, people do. They're looking for an opportunity to do that. And in this story too, the guy who ran the league threatened to sue me for $5 million. So that was a highlight for me, of course. But this is where I started experiencing this. And I just noticed this last night. It makes me feel so ancient now. This little headline over here, this is online gaming trend. This was 2004. Some guy wrote a story about students playing nationwide via computer. So I'm like, what was going on back in 2004? Like, that's as far as we had gotten with online gaming. But again, another example, I went back and spent months in the archives, in the University Archives Library, looking at, based on a rumor, what had happened back in 1970. Of course, some of you know, like Kent State had that notorious shooting there where students were killed by National Guard members. But a lot of things were happening around the country. But Ohio University, there was almost a major incident like that between white and black students, and no one had really written about it before. Now we're talking about, like, at this point, it's been over 30 years. I don't know where these people are. I'm cold calling people on the phone, but you have emotional, affective events even in the past. And I'm not trying to create cognitive overload in anyone, but again, this was a way to connect with people. People wanted to talk about it, and people wanted to read about it. So this is my first experience of, like, how people deal with this content and respond to it. Now, if you go back to right after that in grad school, I did research overseas in Indonesia. Again, my focus was more on communication, but I lived in Islamic boarding schools, and I would shadow proselytizers. In particular, I was shadowing proselytizers who were very progressive minded, and I wanted to understand how they were building their networks. So I did care about content, but really it was more about communication methods than it was theology. What that research turned into, though, was much more participant than observer, and it was ethnographic. But this is where I started to see, like, how do audiences find people or content authentic or not? And this guy was interesting. One of the proselytizers, Kia Maman, who's on the stage here, this would be a typical night with him where I'd follow him around, and we'd go through this process. And it was like a mind-numbing process to do this for hours every night, multiple times a night sometimes. But it was a cultural, historical process, not just a religious process. We'd go to places, you'd sit down, share food with people, meet with local VIPs. Then you'd come out and he'd essentially give a sermon. Then you'd go back and meet with the same people and do the same thing again. This is where I started to see network building. But what was also going on is I started to see a sequence to how this proselytizer shared the kind of depth that he had in his life. And I started to see a process of how people found him authentic. On paper, these audiences that were largely conservative, generational audiences, there's a lot of things they should not have agreed with him on. But they loved this guy. This guy was in such high demand. And here's what I would see. He'd step on stage. He looks like them. He's got credibility because he had been on Hajj. Obviously, he's a religious leader in that community. As a Kiai, he runs Islamic boarding schools. He runs his own mosque. He's dressed to the part. So people have that right away, right? There's that credibility. Then he goes into funny stories, jokes he's telling, songs he starts to recite, almost like oldies but goodies. He'd let the audience finish the song. I mean, these were generational audiences. It'd be like midnight, but you'd have 10-year-olds and you'd have 90-year-olds in the audience. So already now you're starting to build on aspects of, like, nostalgia and humor, and they like this guy. And then the next step, once we get past that, is him starting to share stories about husbands and wives fighting and why tolerance is so important and pluralism of ideas. That's what he was getting through storytelling, are these progressive ideas. But before he got there, he needed to establish that connection with them and that authority and credibility. So in that sense, we also saw a guy who was very vulnerable. At least maybe some of it was performance, but he was vulnerable because he would cry on stage. He would share personal stories. And this, especially looking back on this years later, is where I started to see this idea again, when it comes down to people being vulnerable and people creating moments of affect, then people can really connect with you. I've asked people before in classes, think of the person in your life that you probably respect the most, or just somebody. They think of this person. Then I would often ask them, Do you agree with them on everything? Are there things that you disagree on? Yeah, usually. But see, that doesn't stop you from having a close relationship with them. The fact that you have disagreement on things, that you're different in so many ways, you know them, you've had a chance to be vulnerable with them or vice versa, and that's where you start to see depth in them. They're dimensional. Vanderhyde at Michigan State University, spending a lot of time on his warranting theory research, um, he kind of pointed me to this idea of like, this is truly how you create perceptions of authenticity, is dimensionality. People need to see that you have depth, that you're more than just some individual that they don't really connect with, they're not really close to. This is what Kim Maman was doing, and this was very informative and shaping for me. So when fast forward 20 almost 20 years, when I got to behavioral analysis unit, this is where I started to get introduced to a lot of these theories that kind of shape this stuff out. Cameron Malin, who I used to work with at BAU, introduced a lot of this stuff to me, and then I would meet and get to know some of these scholars like Vanderhyde for warranting theory, Judith Doneth for signaling theory. But these ideas of like, how do audiences evaluate content for authenticity? How do they make some determination on how likely it is this content has been manipulated? Obviously, as you get to understand those models or frameworks, you also learn how to manipulate that, which is obviously of interest to me as well, being in the BAU, and that we had targets in a criminal and national security space where potentially we could apply this online. And I started to, because this whole idea of like, how do you evaluate a persona or sock puppet online for authenticity? Well, you're applying some of the same models or measures to it, in terms of like, what is it about this persona? Usually it comes down to they need to have depth. That's why you have so many sock puppet accounts or personas when they're kind of quiet, when they're not arguing with people, when it doesn't look like, say, your friend's social media account, which is just messy with content and all kinds of different people. That's depth. But when you don't see that in a sock puppet or a controlled persona, then you usually have some kind of indication this is being controlled, it's not genuine. So there was a lot of parallels and applications there. Also at BAU is when I started to spend a lot more time looking at how affect affects our analytical processes, our judgments we make, how open or not we are, any kind of processing of information in that respect, and getting to know people like Gerard Clore at UVA, who's written a lot about this. We really wanted to introduce this into our work so we could provide more depth as well to our behavioral analysis. But this was shaping out some of these original experiences I was having along the way anyway, to like, what causes people to really want to respond and share and engage with content. Of course, you got to have that aspect of the marketing industry, their practices. Did some study in digital marketing, obviously consumer psychology, to kind of understand, even if we're talking about there are psychological underpinnings here, there are practices and techniques where you still see that effect demonstrated. I think a great example of it is looking recently at like word of mouth communication or electronic word of mouth communication. A majority of the literature in that space is focused on, has a scope from a marketing perspective, because they're very interested in like, what kind of markets are we talking about? Individual markets versus more saturated grouped markets. There are those underpinnings of psychology there, of course, but that's not always the approach that they're looking at. There's going to be other aspects of group dynamics and behaviors within those groups and relationships to consider. That's why it was so important, any kind of methodology that we applied to activity at BAU had to be as comprehensive and integrated as possible. So that kind of practice to methodology, informing conceptual methodologies for analytical frameworks, continue to be refined and developed in me at BAU. And then finally, just my experience of working on cases at BAU and that certification and training process. Of course, I'm gonna grow my understanding of human behaviors and how to influence those behaviors, and that everything we do, especially at Behavioral Analysis Unit, was aligned with operational objectives, right? A behavioral objective needs to be aligned to an operational objective. And I do that now even in private sector when I'm applying theory related to cyber deception or other theories, behavioral theories, applying it in practice. to the activity we're looking at, to the threat actors we're looking at. And then the final part of this background, I was already starting to touch on this, but how can I apply all this foundational theory and the experience I've had to analyzing content and then creating behaviorally based content? When I'm talking about behaviorally based content, I'm talking about science-based methodology, like taking all the empirical studies, the theoretical framework, sometimes grounded theory, the conceptual models, and applying it to a target audience so that we can engineer, or that they will be as responsive to it as possible, right? That's the idea here with the behavioral content creation. And of course, there is a spectrum of people that, in targets that I applied this to, sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Usually it worked, but there are a lot of lessons learned from it that I'll share with you today, and lessons I continue to learn from doing this now outside of the FBI, also as a videographer, doing behavioral content creation for cold cases, and then what I also do in my cyber deception work. So this is really, in one line, how I'm defining my conceptual model of the consumer approach. I call it the consumer approach because this is when there isn't necessarily a defined audience, right? Like, you're going to see a video I'm going to share shortly that I made where it's like, I don't have a defined audience. I just know that people are going to respond to this because it has these things, right? It dimensionally integrates affect and vulnerability. And every piece of content I make, no matter what platform, no matter with what medium, it's got to have some measure of inducing affect, and to make people really responsive to the character in that content, I need to portray them as vulnerable. There needs to be some perceived vulnerability. That's where people start to see depth. That's where people start to trust that individual. That's where they start to find them to be authentic. I've replicated this again and again as a practitioner, but I've got to give it due credit as just a conceptual model, because in this defined sense, I haven't studied that empirically with that kind of structured study. It's just as a practitioner and anecdotal examples. But certainly this model is pulling on all kinds of theoretical frameworks. I'll give more examples of that, but you've heard me mention some of them, right? Warranting theory, aspects of information processing and affect, labeling these things with emotion. This could be displayed in a lot of different situations, but this is a consumer approach model. So what I'm going to show you is 3 short videos of examples of it, and then I can talk about it. Hold on, I'm just going to have to switch screens for a second so that you can hear the audio for this. Okay, so this first video you're going to see, this is a video I made when I was still with BAU, and the purpose of this video series, it was on a missing teenager out in the Sacramento area. And one of our objectives was to channel the attention of a very saturated space online to the FBI landing pages where there'd be more information on this case. To give you an example of how saturated the online market was for this, there was a private Facebook group for Carly Busse because she was missing, and it had like 19,000 people in it. So this was a national case. The family had been on Dr. Phil and Nancy Grace. And there is a question of reputation here because most accounts of the family were pretty negative in terms of how they did on those shows and what people thought about them being responsible or not. So what we wanted to do is create a video series that brought depth and dimensionality to this family and this community. Because what that does is it opens the door potentially. If people have information, maybe they're willing to come forward now. Maybe there's more of a connection. There's so many missing people and murdered people out there. How do you get their attention to another case like this? And so we wanted to bring that depth. But here you're going to see an example of, I don't have a specific audience or individual that I'm trying to find, just a lot of unknown people. But I want to create content, behavioral content, that integrates affect and vulnerability. So here's this video of this missing teenager's brother.
It's like my body's telling me that she's still here, but we have absolutely no clue in the right mind where. So my body's thinking, oh, she's here. We just don't see her. She's invisible. I don't know. Or she's gone. I don't know. She might. Whenever I think about her and like where she would be, like most of my body says like she's like, I don't know, in Hawaii or somewhere on a beach or just having fun, hanging out with a bunch of new friends that she made when she was gone, and then she was coming back fine. And then the other little bit of part of me is like, she's probably dead. She got stolen, and then she got just a little bit of tiny me, like a handful of me is just feeling that, and then the rest of my body's just feeling good parts. So the bad part would be like she's getting abused, or I don't know. She's probably sitting in a dark room in a chair, tied up, sitting there, dying of hunger, thirst, and light, and probably dead. Sorry.
So I think you can see in that example, there's affect, there's vulnerability. Obviously, that's unscripted. We chose a child, one person. We wanted people, even if we don't know everything we need to know, for a moment we have a thin slice of him. We can process a little bit more closely this one person and this one moment with him that he probably didn't expect either. That video did the best at 72. It has had, since it came out 3 years ago, 72,000 views and I think over 1,000 likes. But this is an example of how I don't necessarily have a target audience, but I know as a consumer approach model, make it with affect and vulnerability and people will respond to it. In that case, I haven't looked recently, but the top 3 Google search returns for 3 members of that family were on the FBI landing pages. And except for one video, we didn't pay for any advertising. So it's a phenomenal example of organic SEO based on this model. This model is built on the pillars of consumer psychology, right? Marketing practices that say keep videos under 2 minutes, just feature one person, have music. Obviously, there's a lot of research related to that as well. The timing, and you could probably feel that. The timing of when I had music and when I didn't. That's all purposeful. But you see this in marketing of people respond to this kind of content. It's very different than press conference with, say, chief of police. The other 2, I'll show you just one other example of these other 2s because I just want to be cognizant of time, but it'll still bring home the same kind of effect here. This is one of the videos I made since I've left FBI on a cold case of a woman who was murdered in August in Maryland. It's the same kind of approach with the consumer model. I don't have a specific audience necessarily, but I can make content, behavioral content based on this conceptual model.
This is this final resting place of Rachel in this tunnel. Kind of looks like a sewer. I think about her laying here and, I wonder if she was, half awake, looking at the light and just saying, I just got to make it to that light. Is she thinking about her kids? Is she thinking about me? Did she feel hopeless here? Think about warm, feeling warm under her head, and then making the connection, that's blood. It's dark. Did you feel alone? It's not. Think about what she looked like, beaten or whatever. It's still pretty. I don't care how dirty, how scary, how she felt. I wish I could feel it for her, and I won't look away. That's kind of why I'm spending so much time in these tunnels, this tunnel specifically.
So I think even with that example, like there are things that are unexpected and there are also things that were planned. Like I knew that she had been murdered in that tunnel, but in terms of like planning and preparation, that's a persuasive geography. A persuasive geography is not just a physical place, but it's a mental and cognitive place that someone's in, and it can induce further affect. And I wanted him to be in that place as we talked about things he thinks and feels about his sister. Obviously, I'm dealing with things like the lighting, and I know it looks grainier in there, but that's okay. Like, there's a rawness to it, and there's a rawness to what he's sharing. It doesn't escape me that there's also something more thematic there as well with the lightness and the darkness of the tunnel. There's a lot of applications there. We could talk all day about it. Even the aesthetics of like how people respond to websites, how they look, that matters. That matters in crafting that into this behavioral content creation. But that's an example where I didn't necessarily have a defined audience, but that consumer model, that conceptual model works because I literally had no subscribers. And after that and 2 podcasts, I have almost 500. Now, I'll talk a little bit about that, but this kind of content, if you get it in front of people, they respond to it, right? What have I learned so far using the consumer model? Well, there was a study that we never published that we did at BAU trying to understand, like, from a sample of law enforcement type of videos, which traditionally are, they're kind of too long. They have a lot of people in them. They have detectives in suits in conference rooms. They have stock footage of crime scene tape. And those don't do well in terms of metrics. And I also would surmise from what I see and from what I've heard from them, they don't do well either in terms of getting some kind of behavioral response out of audiences or even meeting any kind of objectives in the case. What we wanted to see is which cues really cause people to engage the most with that media. And the issue is the kind of content I was making for cold cases was so different than the traditional law enforcement content we were typically seeing. You couldn't really put them in the same sample, but it was an approach to start trying to understand and explore, like, are there particular cues? Can you replicate the cues in marketing practices that seem to be very effective? Because this is a technique that, at least anecdotally, have proven is effective to further cold case investigations, depending what your objectives are. But it's not necessarily even novel. But in law enforcement space, it kind of is. And no one's really doing it. But this is a study where it's difficult to find statistical significance unless you really structure this correctly, because there's so many things you can't control and too many unknowns. Like, does it matter they paid for advertising or not? Yeah, of course it does. Does it matter how many subscribers they have on their platform? Yeah, it does. So that study could have been crafted a little bit better, but it still was another step towards trying to explore this. I've been trying to find like one of the articles I read on this, but I found another one this morning related to websites. And this was just kind of interesting. This idea of trying to pursue niche audiences is often not very productive. And that when you look at the kind of content on different streaming platforms like Hulu and Netflix, a lot of it's the same. There's a lot of redundant audiences in terms of like true crime type of stuff or rom-com type of stuff. And there might be different things, but sometimes there's not. And they're finding trying to reach a niche audience is not necessarily that effective if that's like a marketing approach. And I'm finding the same thing with these kind of models, like plan on redundant overlaid audiences if you're trying to reach a certain kind of general audience, because that's where you get more of a response than just trying to make something very niche for a niche audience. True crime audience is definitely special. Obviously there are people who make videos putting on makeup, talking about murders, and they'll have like 3 million views and a great following. So, but there is something about them. Like as soon as I was kind of tagged up in these podcast interviews with their audiences that are very interested in this kind of stuff, those subscribers went way up. And so that's definitely an aspect of this. You can make this content, but you need that right audience connection. Again and again, whether it's completely authentic content or it's been manipulated in some way, People respond best to content that's warranted. And this goes back to what I was saying about warranting theory, which is really the way, trained or not trained, people make evaluations on the stuff they see online, in terms of how likely is it this has been manipulated. And people can assign high and low warranting value to that based on that. And there's some great studies on this. Great example is Vanderhyde with some others did a study on eBay bids and purchases. And all he did was they took a picture of a package of golf balls on someone's basement rug. That was one of them. Other one was a stock photo. And they wanted to see which one got more bids, which one got more purchases. And what they found is that there were more bids and more purchases for the photo of the golf balls on a kind of a grimy basement rug. Their conclusion from that was people assigned high warranting value to that content because look at the picture, it looks real, this is a real person, if I buy it, I'm probably going to get it. A stock photo, people may have rated that much lower in terms of warranting value because they might think maybe this is a scam. I don't know if it's real. Again and again on this kind of content, anything you can do to make it look as authentic as possible, that it's not being controlled, people respond best to that. Even things such as the style of filming I do, which is very journalistic, and I don't like a lot of edited or cut scenes. I want it to just go nonstop, even if it's a short video, because I don't want people to believe this has been manipulated in any kind of way. Even including my question in their answer. We've seen in studies of press conferences with Chinese government officials when footage was played that included the journalist's question, they even thought the official's response was that much more genuine because they heard the question too. I'm applying it the same in terms of behavioral content creation. I mentioned persuasive geography. That's one element of persuasion. Cialdini coined that term, but persuasion is a little bit different than priming or prompting. It's just making someone much more responsive, much more open to saying yes to something before they get the content, before they get the message. And so that's very critical in planning and content creation for behavioral content creation. And also trying to channel audience's attention to that content. It's critical. It's got to be a part of the production of behavioral content creation. Yeah, processing fluency, of course, is not just about the content, but how it's framed. I had wondered in prior cases, does it make a difference, even if I know this case is a homicide, that people think it's just a missing person? Anecdotally, it seems like it does. That people just don't care as much about missing people as they do people that were murdered. And that's a framing issue or question in terms of processing fluency, but trying to make this as straightforward as possible. That's why I've even found with YouTube Shorts, for example, those often do the best. And that's kind of a no-brainer to a lot of people at this point, I know, but it's still following the same kind of model of affect, moments of vulnerability, and it's short enough that people can pay attention and process it, right? And there's enough description with it that people get what this is about. It's very important. I've seen it again and again, this play out. Finally, that public relations generally just doesn't get it. There were some great examples of collaboration with public affairs at the FBI, and also some not so great examples of collaboration where they were doing things that, despite guidance on this is not going to be effective, they still did it anyway. And sure enough, it wasn't effective. And even today, outside of the Bureau, I've had conversations with public relations firms that do crisis communications and messaging with police departments. And I'm scratching my head after the conversation because they will often say, I don't understand this, or I don't understand why we need something like this, because they're still sticking to press conferences with the police chief or very structured corporate-like content and videos. And again, people trained or not, they just don't find that stuff as entertaining or as authentic. So this continues to be a strange disconnect. The final part, and there's not as much on this because this is obviously much more of a sensitive area, and there's a lot of things I can't share because of how I use this when I was with the FBI, but then I'll be done and we can get into Q&A. So thank you for your patience up until this point and your attention. The concentrated approach would be the other conceptual model here, and it's not that much different, but it is a little bit, because we're still talking about dimensionally and this time relationally integrating emotions and vulnerabilities. And you see the difference there. I didn't say affect. course, it could include that. But I say emotions because emotions are different in the sense that we're labeling them. Somebody has interpreted a person or an event with some kind of emotional tag or label. When you look at the research on emotion and affect, there's definitely a difference, and it's object oriented. There's a particular object, be it a person, a place, a memory, whatever. If it has an emotion tied to it, you can work within that scope and make content and messaging that is much more, to make them much more responsive to that in particular. And of course, vulnerabilities. From one perspective, behavioral analysis is really about identifying vulnerabilities. I saw something recently that I almost wanted to say something on LinkedIn, but I didn't want to be one of those people where someone was talking about emotional intelligence, saying you could stamp out social engineering with emotional intelligence. And if you have emotional intelligence, you're not vulnerable to social engineering, which was insane. It's absolutely insane. I don't know what basis they're talking about in that. Because I think people often forget, when I'm talking about vulnerabilities, I'm not just talking about your weaknesses. In fact, I'm talking about your strengths. So as no matter how purposeful or driven or strong someone believes they are, to me, that's a massive vulnerability. And what behavioral analysis really showed me was how to find people's vulnerabilities and exploit them. Even if that's distasteful to some people, that's what we're really talking about as well. But in a marketing sense, it can be much more benign and vanilla, in terms of like, we want them to be responsive to this behaviorally. We want a return on investment. But this is what I'm talking about. And relationships are so key here. It's a little bit of a different approach from, not novel, but a different approach to what you'll see historically on approaches to influencing and mass communication, that maybe top-down approaches in an organization are effective, but we often would look at just groups of people in a relationship, that they're truly the people that you probably make your decisions based off of how they're going to respond, how it's going to impact them. That's really often what motivates people. So when we're looking at creating content to influence behavior in a target, we really need to know who they're in a relationship with, the people they hate too, because that could come into how you really motivate them to take a step. So I always love when I come up with ridiculous stuff from some of the AI generators. I think I typed in here an insecure ransomware hacker who clicks on something he shouldn't have clicked on, and it created this ridiculous photo. But I'm giving you an example of a case where there was content that it created that I repurposed, and the idea was to get this guy to click on something. Of course, he should never click on any link. But he did, and using the concentrated approach, this model of dimensionally integrating affect and vulnerability in a relationship and getting people to be responsive. In this scenario, there was someone who wanted to share a link with him with a video. This guy he knew, he actually couldn't stand this guy because he had had very hostile communication. But he said, I think this includes your voice. I think this is about you. So we thought, can we make this irresistible? Can we look at the research on curiosity? For hackers, it hasn't really focused on the literature on curiosity that has approached this from like a negative seeking kind of drive. It's been other aspects, right? Like they're motivated to make money, or they want to have a great reputation, and they're curious about this or that. Curiosity in terms of what drives people to seek things, find out things that are probably going to be negative, you craft that into it. This is where there's that aspect of vulnerability and affect. And then the relationship with this guy in this particular case, that's all it was, and he clicked on it because he wanted to see what it said about him. And another example was a request to make something that there was a group of pilots who were coming forward based on things they had seen or maybe witnessed, and we wanted to kind of override that stigma and have a visual depiction of like authority and credibility in the form of another pilot who's maybe a peer of theirs who represents all these things that they would like and respond to, but then he's also sharing his experience and why he decided to come forward. That's an example again of a concentrated approach, because we're crafting content that has an aspect of emotions related to it and some affect. There's vulnerability because this pilot is sharing something that could be seen as embarrassing, but he's being vulnerable about it. And then relationships, because they likely see him as a peer. He was once in their position. He has relationships out in this particular kind of community. So this is that dimensional integration of all those things. And in this case, this video was made. A lot of people saw this video, these pilots, and their rates of reporting these encounters and incidents went up pretty dramatically. So I apologize that it couldn't be more specific, but I'm trying to give you some sanitized version. And here's the last slide. What have I learned so far about the concentrated approach model? Well, you've really got to go back to Petty and Casipio for some of their earlier work on these like dual processing mechanisms and this cognitive processing. Specifically, their research on like what motivates people and what are they actually going to process from it. There's been other examples in the past that have been very sobering to us. When I was with BAU, things that we made that we thought this is going to go viral, people are really going to respond to it, and they didn't. And so that was kind of sobering. But when we go back to the literature and research on this, we found again, did we hit these certain marks here? Like, can they even process this if it's in another language other than their own? That's going to be kind of difficult, right? It's going to impede their processing fluency. Are they even motivated to want to process this? Maybe it's really sensitive and they're just not going to touch that. And because they don't want people to associate them with that content. Those are things that we miss, but the literature is strong and it's there. So I've learned, got to go back to that and really structure things if you want that to be effective. Even if you don't know a lot about a target audience, this is often still very effective. There have been cases where we literally had one behavioral artifact that in response to that artifact, they have an emotional response or some kind of affect, and we can build something around that. So I've seen them be very responsive to it, even if you only have one that you can point to and build around it. No one can really agree on what to call this and how they feel about it. Is it deception? Is it information operations? Is it psychological warfare? I still think there's debate about that. I have found that I've got to pick my audience carefully and the words I use carefully so people understand it and that they're comfortable with it. Repurposed content seems to be the most impactful, because if you can take something that someone else has already made and add to it or repurpose it, it's that much more authentic typically, because they see it as kind of indisputable. Like, this person made it, even if someone added something to it, there's some level of authenticity here. I might see some manipulation, but still that original content is authentic. And it's even hard for that person to dispute it, right? The messenger is important, but I think the receiver's relationships are more important. Yeah, I would agree. Of course, those communication models are effective. They work. You want to stick to it, right? Like, who's your messenger? Make sure they definitely get it. And then make sure you understand your receiver. But the relationships around them, I've found again and again, that's where you're really pulling on those emotional levers to get them to behave in a particular kind of way. I mean, you think about your own choices you make in your life, you're often seriously considering how people in your family are going to respond to it, right? A behavioral objective or outcome is the only measure of success. In the concentrated approach, I would say yes, this is definitely true, because it's not enough to say, well, I hope more tips come in, or look at how many people watched this, or how many people shared it. That's great. It's just one measure. If you can't align it to a behavioral objective, then you haven't reached, success in that regard. And this is part of good planning for behavioral content creation. You've got to plan for that kind of outcome, that they engage in the behavior you want them to engage in. And finally, I continue to find more examples of how this can be used in so many different ways. One of the last cases I worked on at BAU, I was interviewing these two family members, and they were also persons of interest. But I still had to, perform it in a way that we're making this for public use, and we want to hear stories about this, this, and that. No one's being accused of anything. But when I brought it back to the investigative team, instead of what you usually find when you think about like the sociology of how people collect information and then frame it and then report it, and how that changes the information or influences it, or there's biases in that. Instead of it being a situation where someone writes up an interview, then people can read that, or they share with a few other people on their squad. Oh yeah, this came up, this was the highlight. I took the raw video footage and showed it to a room full of like 40 investigators. that night. So everybody had different takeaways from that raw content. I didn't do anything to it. I just connected it and pushed play. And that could be very effective when you're actually trying to glean even more behaviors and other aspects from someone's personality and the content that you're observing. The concentrated approach finally really has its greatest utility in being an investigative or operational technique, but that's obviously very hard to talk about and promote publicly when you're trying to offer this as a service. The consumer approach is something that's much more tasteful and digestible for people. And that's all I have for my slides. So let me go ahead and switch back to the video. Yeah, and please, if you have any questions, I'd be glad to take your questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation to the Cognitive Security Institute. You may learn more about topics in cognitive security by visiting us at cognitivesecurity.institute.